Hello, everybody. Happy Thursday. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on SharePoint best practices and why you need them. My name is Tara Harms, and I am the Director of Training and SharePoint Services for Spindustry. Today, we have a panel of our SharePoint experts joining us. Zach Eisenhower and Jared Edge from Spindustry and Ryan Stefani from our SharePoint partner, Crow Canyon. Before I turn it over to them to introduce themselves, I wanted to mention that we'll be answering all questions at the end of the webinar. Please feel free to type your questions in the question box and we'll make sure to answer each one. The webinar is scheduled for 1 hour, so if we run out of time, we'll stay on to make sure they get answered. Now let me turn it back over to the panel so they can introduce themselves and get started. Zach?
My name is Zachary Eisenhower, and I'm a technical support administrator here at Spindustry. My primary focus is infrastructure design and implementation, as well as SharePoint server implementations.
And my name is Ryan Stefani. I work at Crow Canyon. We do out-of-the-box applications for SharePoint on-premise and SharePoint online, as well as a set of tools that helps you better utilize SharePoint. And I manage our clients as well as some of our projects.
And my name is Jared Edge, and I am the Director of SharePoint Services here at Spindustry. So we really wanted to fashion today's talk or webinar in the form of a discussion. There's a lot to talk about. We have about an hour to go through it. In today's discussion, these are the things we'll be talking about. We'll first take on SharePoint as a one-stop shop and SharePoint as the one true source of information. These are very important things. And then we'll go through several best practices and things that we feel are very at the top of our list for best practices. So following SharePoint best practices to make your environment last for the life of your organization, very important. Following SharePoint best practices to make sure you can find your data and your documents even 10 years from now, that's huge. And then following best practices to make sure your data is secure. Everybody's always concerned about security, and so are we. And then following best practices to keep your data safe inside your inside your organization. So those are our topics for today. We're just going to have just a nice, open, and honest, transparent discussion as we go through all of it.
So the first topic that we're going to look at is the one-stop shop and one true source of information. And the questions that I'm going to be reading are questions that we got from some of our clients, and they are, what do we mean by using SharePoint as a one-stop shop? What are some considerations that our clients have seen, good or bad? What do we mean when we refer to SharePoint as a one source of information? It sounds good, but is it possible to achieve?
So I'll take that. These are some really good questions. And like Tara said, that we went to our existing clients and to some of our partners as well and said, hey, when you're thinking about best practices, what are some of the questions that you really have inside of it? And so we have this nice list of questions here we'll be discussing today. But as far as SharePoint as a one-stop shop, what do we mean by that? Well, really, if you think about it, a really nice scenario to have within your organization would be that if a person comes on board to your organization, brand new, they should be able to go to one place and find everything they need to do their job or everything that concerns the organization that pertains to them. So having SharePoint as that one place that they go to is really, really kind of a very convenient thing. And what that means is if Zach comes in today and he says, well, you know, how do I do this or where do I find this? We could really just say, go to SharePoint to find that. You know, you have HRIS systems, you have payroll systems, you have all these different things. Even the items that are external to SharePoint could really start with a link on your SharePoint environment so that they can just go to that one place, that one-stop shop to find everything that they're looking for. And it really helps with onboarding processes. It really helps with making sure that as a whole, your organization knows exactly where things should go and where the correct information is, where they'll find the correct information. That kind of ties into having one true source of information as well. And you know, the question as to can you achieve this, in our opinion, you can. You can achieve this, and it's not really hard to achieve as well. that one true source of information. Everyone's had this specific problem where, you show up at a meeting, Zach shows up at the meeting and Zach's got one version of the contract. I show up at the meeting, I've got another version of the contract, and Tara's got a completely different version, and she's edited hers, Zach's edited his a little bit, and we've all been working out of different places. Or you have those employees who want to make sure they have their backup copy of a specific document or project that they're working on. So not only is it maybe on your shared drive, but it also lives on their desktop, and they've been working off that copy. What if we could get it so that the one true source of information was really just sitting there on SharePoint? So instead of being on a shared drive, it's on SharePoint. What does that give you? That gives you all those versioning things. You get versioning so people don't have to worry about holding on because they're going to lose a specific copy. You've got everything right there in the right place. And I think when you change your culture a little bit to move toward these two topics, I think what you're looking for in a SharePoint environment really is to have that one-stop shop and that one true source of information. If you can achieve those two things, which we think is absolutely possible, then we think that organization-wide you will have a better experience as you go through day-to-day life. Anyone else have a comment on that?
I just want to say, I completely agree. Most of our conversations circle around integrating with other third-party systems, but the main hub is SharePoint, right? That seems to be the hot topic with all of our customers lately, as well as how can we use all of our applications in conjunction with SharePoint to make it easier for our end users to not only use the applications that you already have in place, but better use their SharePoint environment as well. Really take advantage of what the investment you've made, whether it's SharePoint on-prem or SharePoint online, and really start to connect all the dots and bring it back into a one-stop shop.
Yeah. All right, so I think that's good for that topic. Let's go on to the next.
The next topic is following SharePoint best practices to make your environment last for the life of the organization. And the question is, what best practices can our clients implement to make sure that their SharePoint experience is a great one?
So I'll start this one off as well. Number one on our list of best practices overall is governance. Have a governance plan, have a talk about governance, have some guidance there for your end users, have some guidance around how SharePoint's supposed to work in your environment. And it's a very important thing. And it's not just SharePoint, it's Office 365 as well. So if you're in the cloud space there, it is how will this enormous, outstanding tool be used for us? Do we want to use it the way Microsoft says? Maybe not. We have to figure out how is it best going to serve our organization. And so as there is no cookie cutter template for how it should be used. We don't go to one client and say, here's the rules, this is how you do it. We go to a client and we say, let's have a conversation. Let's talk about all the different things that are pitfalls and all the different things that are pluses, and let's figure out how we can make it work best for your environment. And let's write all that down. And I just want to stress a couple of different things. You can't just go online and find someone else's written up governance document and then say, hey, this is ours. We're going to just go by these rules. It doesn't work that way. And it can't just be you and the CIO or CTO sitting down to talk about governance. It really, the two of you could probably write down some rules, and you might have some experience around it, but you really need to have a conversation with the majority of your organization. So around governance, we suggest many things. We suggest, first of all, that it's all inclusive. So you want to have representation from all the departments within your organization. So if you're a 3,000 person organization, you need someone who represents everybody within that 3,000. If you are a 12-person shop, perhaps your governance is easier, but you still need governance. You need a plan for how it's going to grow, how it's going to work, how documents are going to work, and what the culture should be around your SharePoint. So your governance talk might be a little bit easier, and you could actually, if you had the ability, you could have everyone in that conversation, but you still need to have that conversation and get some plans around it. And so, the other thing I'll say about that is we don't recommend that, and I'm sorry if there's any IT people out there who can hear this, but we don't recommend that IT is the one that controls everything. The governance committee has several pieces and several roles within inside of it. You need an executive sponsor, someone who can basically back what you're saying needs to be done. And that implements or helps implement the end user adoption and also help implement the change of culture that you're actually trying to make. Then you need that representation. So you need a core governance team there with representation from each of the departments. And I'll just give you this example. and I'll try to keep this short. We have a client who we went in and we were doing governance for, and we had these certain plans for a certain piece of the puzzle. And one of the representatives said, you know what, that's not going to work for any of my people, because the people she represented were line workers. They were out and about all the time in a utility truck, going and fixing wires on poles and things like that. And their only interaction with the rest of the company was to come back into a break room and have their either morning meetings or their weekly meetings and things like that. And so we had to figure out, how do we get information out to those people as well? And had we not had all the representation there, we wouldn't have figured that out until after the fact. And then we had poor end user acceptance on there. So those are just some things that we think are very important. When we go into I'll let Zach talk a little bit about this. When we go into a client to speak to them, Zach, tell them some of the things that we actually talk about when we go through governance.
Yeah, so I mean, and before I say that, I do want to mention that governance isn't just about how SharePoint is set up. It encompasses the entire experience, from building it from the ground up with servers all the way up through who has control of what information within SharePoint. And so when we go into an environment, we start talking with a governance team and guiding them through the process of creating their governance document. We always start talking about risks. We spend a lot of time talking about risks. Obviously, if you don't understand the risks, you're bound to fall right into them, and that will inevitably lead to serious issues that could threaten the governance.
Yeah, and I'll say that the shortest amount of time that we've ever talked about risk within this 3-day session that we normally do, the shortest amount of time is like an hour and a half of just listing things that could go wrong with this environment.
Right, right. And then we talk about things like the roles, and that's roles within the environment, logically, in terms of site stewards, the people that are actually managing the sites themselves, and farm admins and site collection admins and that kind of thing. But then also, like Jared was mentioning, who's the executive sponsor, who's the main IT contact, and who's in charge, who's really leading the governance committee. And in defining those roles and putting them in the governance document, you form a level of accountability from those people, and not necessarily accountability from the perspective of one throat to choke kind of situation, but rather more accountability of knowing, oh, something's not right here. Who do I contact to get this resolved, or at the very least get the conversation going to find that solution?
Yeah, and then some other things we might talk about might be the physical and logical design. So if you're on-prem, that's a huge one for you. If you are online, you still need to consider, how am I going to lay this SharePoint out so that it has growth potential, and so that I don't have to reboot in a year or so. And then migrations and things like that. So if we're moving, let's say part of your plan is to get everything off your shared drives.
Yeah, I mean, we have a tool that we use called Fusion that can help with that process, but there's other options as well to move that data, and we always want to make sure that we aren't moving the data as is. We want to make sure that that data is clean and organized, so that when it ends up in your new environment, whether it's on-premises SharePoint or SharePoint Online, it's already conforming to governance standards.
Right. Right, so that's huge. And then of course security and whether you're going to brand it or not, but also training and end user experience. Those are things that need to be discussed in governance, so that you can figure out how you're going to train, who you're going to train, and then how you're going to make sure that you roll this out so that it's responsible, but it doesn't overwhelm everyone, and so that the end users can easily adapt to it and accept it, and make the experience good. It's all about making sure there's a great experience through your entire SharePoint life, not just for 1 year, not just for 2 years, but for a 20-year experience. That's what you're planning for. So those who go and someone says, your company says, hey, we're going to adopt SharePoint, go stand that up for us. Stop right there, because if you just go in and install it, or just go set it up in Office 365 and just start using it, you're running down a path that you're going to have to restart on.
Right, and as an additional step to the training and user acceptance is what we recommend all of our clients do is create a governance SharePoint site, a site dedicated to governance, and all of the rules and the risks and all the roles, everything is documented. Documentation is always good, but then on top of that, you make that information easily available to everyone in the organization.
Yep. All right.
Yeah, just if I could jump in real quick. I mean, what you guys are saying runs parallel to to what we experience as well. Obviously, we're not setting up SharePoint instances. That's not what Crocanian does, but the companies that are the most successful with us, whether it's an out-of-the-box application or the tool set, follow these guidelines, right? They have someone who's going to manage the project. They have, they've considered the migration, the security, and then the training and the end user acceptance. That's the big one. I mean, if you already have a positive experience in your SharePoint world, being able to kind of build out your SharePoint environment hinges heavily upon that, right? It all follows this guide or this timeline of, I have SharePoint, you know, what can I do with it? Well, there's an intranet. Now I know I can build these applications out, whether they're front office software or back end. And that's all we're relying upon setting it up correctly the first time. So when you are ready for a help desk or you are ready for a purchasing request system, it's just a natural extension of what you're already doing, as opposed to, like Jared said, rebooting after the first year or second year.
Yeah, and I think some of the things on our second point here are our second best practice also apply to the same thing you just said, Ryan. If your clients, when it gets to that point where they're getting ready to purchase those projects, if they've already adopted content types and they've already adopted managed metadata and they're using these things that enhance the system, then I think that's a better scenario for everyone. So number 2 on our list of best practices would be good document hygiene. Okay, if we mentioned a little bit before, but if you're going to move, part of your plan is to move all of your shared drives over into SharePoint, it would be not wise, I guess, to take if you have a mess there inside of your shared drives, to move that mess over into SharePoint, into your new SharePoint environment. There are some key things that can really help you out in this area. And every time we've gone to a new client and they say, well, we've had a bad experience with SharePoint, can you help us get this turned around? The first thing we'll ask them is, 1, did you have governance? The answer will be no. And then the second and third thing we'll ask them is, did you use content types? They'll say, what's a content type? And did you use managed metadata? Well, we know that's in there, but we never really turned it on. So without these things, you're kind of going down a road that doesn't make sense. Content types are really around classifying what type of documents or what type of content is going to be inside the environment. So for example, SharePoint understands if you're going to put a Word document in there, it understands what a PDF document is, it understands what an Excel document is, it understands these types of documents. But what it doesn't understand is that PDF that you just put in there was a resume, or that PDF that you just put in there was a contract, or that Excel document that you just put in there was a purchasing order, or something like that. It doesn't understand those pieces. And so it's up to you to kind of classify what type of documents are going to be added into your system, and so that when they go in, SharePoint, the end user can say, oh, well, this is an actual contract, and they can mark it. And now SharePoint knows that if you want to look for contracts, it has a great idea of how to find contracts for you.
Right, and it goes a step further than that. Since content types have columns, just like all other lists and libraries within SharePoint, you can assign metadata directly to that document, so it's visible to SharePoint and searchable by SharePoint.
Yeah, and so that's a good discussion, actually. And I could talk to you about content types for like 3 days. So what I normally try to tell people is, first, just get the content types in there. If you do that much, we're golden. But you should also do what Zach said. Let's take a look at these content types and see what additional data do I want in there. So for example, if it's a contract, I might want to know who signed the contract, or what date the contract was signed, or when does the contract expire. I want to know that information, and the content types can help me with that. And managed metadata is the second piece of this puzzle to make sure you have good document hygiene and searchable documents as well. And what that really means is it's the information that you're attaching to that document, like we were just talking about these columns, but it's one that you would manage. So for example, if I have a list of acronyms, I can manage those acronyms. Or if I have terms that mean multiple things, like for example, you have IT, we call IT here at Spindustry, we call it the IT department, or we call it support, or some of us call it help desk, some of us call it Zach, you know. And so what are the different names for this specific thing? I could actually go to my managed metadata and say, okay, we are now going to use the term IT, but an alias for that is information technology, and another alias for that is help desk, and another alias for that is support. And so that way, when I go through and I'm looking for searchable content, or search is trying to help you find something, if you just type in IT, but the document is about support, it'll still find that. You see, so you're teaching SharePoint that, hey, these are different meanings for these specific terms. And it's very valuable for helping with consistency within your documents and your data. All right, so I think that's good for that topic. Let's go to the next one.
The next topic is following SharePoint best practices to make sure you can find your data and documents even 10 years from now. The questions are, how can our clients make sure that search is accurate? Can SharePoint search be altered to make it better? And what are some of the ways that our clients have leveraged search?
Those are really good questions. And number 3 on our list of best practices would be have a healthy search system. And I'll let Zach kick it off.
Yeah, and by healthy search system, we're going to start with the technical aspect, and that really boils down to making sure that your search services are in a healthy state. And in order for that to happen, they need to be disconnected from the web front ends. You don't want that stuff gumming up the works of the place where people actually go to SharePoint. And you want that functionality separated out on their own servers in ideal situations so that they can perform at their maximum capacity and are ideally redundant as well. And there's a lot of different pieces that go into that, but performance is imperative. And it's something that I know Jared will probably mention here in just a minute again, but if your search isn't performant and it's not accurate, then people aren't going to use it, right? It's going to lose its value. So when you're building out your search system, you need to take into account some of the technical requirements of search and how that will impact the rest of your SharePoint environment.
Yeah, and largely on-prem, we're talking about where you place those things on different servers. In the cloud, I mean, we're also saying, well, search is already set up for you. It's all behind the scenes, but you still need some other things there. You need to plan to have search as part of your plan. So you still need to worry about things that make search better, content types, manage metadata, just metadata inside of a list or library in general. All those things really help search be able to find things for you. But even with all of that, there's still a problem. So I'll give this scenario, and hopefully I can keep this kind of short. Let's imagine that you are searching, you've written a document called, that has in it, it's all about a red car. And let's just say it's a contract about a red car. And there's been a year that's passed, and other people have written documents that have the word red in it. Some have written documents that have the word red car in it. Some have written documents where the word red is there, but then two paragraphs later, the word car is there. And some have written documents where their name is actually car with a red hood, And so all of those documents, you have to believe that SharePoint's search system could find every single one of those documents. But how it rates them is going to be different. So if there's 150 documents, all that have red car in it, it's going to bring them all back. And yours might be at the bottom of the pile because yours only says red car one time, where all the rest said red car more often than what you said. And so that's just the way search works. That's the way Google works. That's the way Bing works. They all are doing the same thing. They do it with different algorithms, but they're all doing the same thing. What you want is to be able to search for something, entering a keyword, red car, but then when you get the results back, you want to be able to tell search more. You want to say search, oh, it was a contract, so that's a content type. And oh, search, hey, it also had this metadata. It was created between this date and this date a year ago. You want to be able to refine your search like that. And let me kind of put that in perspective. So if you go to Google and you do a search for red car, you'll get 500 million hits or something like that, and you'll have to scroll through. No one ever goes past the first page. You just, if you think, oh gosh, I'd like to refine this a little bit, you put another keyword up in the search box and you hit go again. It goes out and does another search, a complete different search, and brings you back a completely different billion hits. But if you go to Amazon and you do something like that, so I went to Amazon and I searched for, hand sanitizer, and I get back, 1,000 hits for hand sanitizer. But then on the left-hand side, I can click Prime. And then it just shows me everyone who's Prime, and that narrows down the list. It doesn't go out and do a new search. It just takes what's there and narrows it down. Then I can say 4 stars, and then it narrows it down some more. That's called search refinement. And you can do that inside of SharePoint. You can do it if you are taking advantage of content types, managed metadata, and just regular metadata inside of a list. Yes, you have to do a little bit of extra work to make these things work, but we say that that should be part of your governance plan, not an afterthought. So in your governance plan, we want to see you say, we are going to modify search, and we are going to take full advantage of the features that are available to us.
Yeah, you definitely want to define all of those pieces as a part of governance, because search is such a big part of SharePoint. If you just make it up as you go along, it's going to get out of hand, and governance is going to actually fall apart across the entirety of SharePoint. And but you mentioned it, Jared, already, that something we encourage people to do, and what should be a part of your governance document, is how you're going to customize search. And you really should customize search as much as you can, so that it fits your organization and gives you the search results that you need.
Yeah, and before I let Ryan jump in on that as well, to talk more about the customizing it, I'll just say that we have several clients where we work with where they have tons and tons of documents, say for agents or for end users, things like that, and the entire front-facing piece of SharePoint, everything on every page is all driven by search. Everything.
Right. No, I totally agree. I mean, for me, it all kind of circles back to the main point of, how can I use SharePoint to benefit me, or how can I effectively use my SharePoint space, right? I've said it, and I say it all the time. It's like, we made the investment into SharePoint on-premise or SharePoint Online, and how can it help me? And we obviously catch the back end, once a company like Spindustry gets you set up with proper, content types, managed metadata, we really take advantage of that in our own search features. Like, we've even gone out of our way to create a list search app in our tool set. And even taking it one step further, we use natural language processing through our chatbot to find a knowledge-based article for your end users. Say if they want to look for an article on their printer and why their printer isn't working, they can just start to type printer, and it's going to pull up all the relevant articles related to printer, but they have to be tagged right. The content types have to be set up correctly. So if you do this work on the front end, using your SharePoint environment, using our applications after the fact, it's just going to be that much easier. And again, it's going to increase your end user adoption.
Excellent. So I think we're out of time on that topic, so we're going to move to the next topic.
The next topic is following best practice to make sure your data is secure. The questions are, what is the best way to manage users in SharePoint by direct permissions, SharePoint groups, Active Directory groups? And the next topic is Office 365 groups versus Active Directory security groups.
Ooh, it's a good one. All right, so
number 4 is a big one, and it's best practices for security. And what we always recommend to everyone is that as a best practice, you should be using something called AGLP. That's where you have Active Directory users assigned to Active Directory groups that are then assigned to local SharePoint groups, and the permissions for SharePoint, whether it's a site, it's a document, it's a library, are assigned to those local groups within SharePoint.
Yeah.
And this makes things much easier for management as well as administration, because you no longer have to worry about Bob was directly added to this list for permissions and Bob just transferred out of here. Who's going to remember to go take Bob off that list?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so I'll say 2 things. One, we didn't come up with this. I mean, this is an old honored tradition from Microsoft. I mean,
Yes.
I learned this in my beginning days, years and years and years ago. But I also say that you're exactly right, Zach. I mean, if we have this in place, then whose responsibility is it to make sure that Bob has the right permissions for something? It becomes IT's responsibility. So many of you in large organizations already have a system in place for when a person gets permissions to something, even if it's with your shared drives. So you put in a help desk ticket, the IT department gets it. Maybe it went through a workflow or something like that to maybe it went to a manager, and the manager says, yes, they need access to this or something like that. But then IT puts them into a Active Directory group, and then boom, it just trickles down to what's needed. And we think that's the best practice. It's an honored time tradition. I think it's the best place to go. Having said that,
Our number 5, which is more like a 4.5 really, is the next best practice for security. And essentially, this is where we just drop that G from AGLP and we assign Active Directory accounts, users, directly to local SharePoint groups. And the permissions are still assigned to the local SharePoint groups and never to the accounts directly.
Yep. So this is acceptable in several scenarios. If I'm a smaller shop, so I've got 12 people, then maybe it's okay for you to adopt this particular type of security as well. Even for a large organization, though, there are several places where this might apply. So this is something that has to be governed. So you're going to tightly govern in certain areas, you're going to loosely govern in others. This will be one of those places where you loosely govern. And what that means is, if I have things like a project management site, or if I need 2 teams to collaborate and I spin up a site for them, maybe we don't have time for it to actually go all the way back up through a help desk ticket and then filter all the way down. And I certainly don't want IT spending hours creating new groups and then getting rid of groups, and then creating new groups and then getting rid of groups every time we spin up a new project site. And so you have to have that give and take. You have to have that loosely governed and that tightly governed piece. And so we think that this next best practice is really the result of that. And like Zach said, the one thing that we're trying to avoid by using one of these two, number 4 or number 5, or 4.5, the one thing we're trying to achieve is to make sure that no individual person gets assigned direct permissions. They should always be in a group, whether that means global groups or whether it means local groups. They should always be in a group.
Right, and this kind of setup really speaks to agility in the permission space, like Jared was mentioning, the ability to stand up a project site, put the people that are supposed to be on that project within the local SharePoint group in that site, and then when the project's done, that site can be removed or archived or what have you, and it's all packaged and taken care of. It's out of everyone's mind, and there's no rogue permissions just sitting out there.
Yeah.
And it does need to be governed, and that deciding when loose permission or loose governance is needed and tight governance is needed needs to be documented within your governance document and your governance site.
Yep. And in that same discussion through governance, you would also see that we need to train people on how to use this next best practice, and so how do we incorporate that into the site steward training that we're going to do, and how do we allow users to understand that that's the way we're going to do permissions as well? So those pieces are all important. Otherwise, you're going to run into poor end user acceptance. If you try to stand up several project sites that people need to come in and out of, and they can't get permissions to it, or they have to go through hoops to do it, they're going to find some rogue way to do it. Right, simple as that. Mm-hmm. So, all right, Ryan, you have anything for that?
No, I think you guys covered it really well. My thought was, when they get to us, whether it's building out their SharePoint front processes or out-of-the-box applications, and a customer already has these permissions set up and ready to go, it just makes the adoption that much easier.
Awesome. So let's talk about number 6 then, and I'm going to give you all a warning. This is a very passionate area that we're about to discuss, okay? And so this is Office 365 groups versus Active Directory groups. And we know that a lot of you are out there and you've experienced the fact that these Office 365 groups are there, and that Microsoft is trying to, in some places, even hide the fact that you're about to create one, and all of a sudden they're created. And let's let Zach tell us, what is it good? Is that good or is that bad?
Yeah, so just to backtrack a little bit, there's, like we mentioned in the security piece there's Active Directory groups that exist out there, and SharePoint can use those Active Directory groups. Those Active Directory groups are more often than not security groups, and they are a lot of times mail enabled, which means that you could send an email to the IT group, and everyone in the IT group is going to get that email. There's some really good use cases for that kind of situation. And it's all managed through Active Directory, so IT and support or whoever is managing your Active Directory can tightly control that and govern that. Office 365 groups, on the other hand, are groups that are created within Office 365. They're mail-enabled, just like Active Directory mail-enabled security groups are, and it does create a security group within Azure Active Directory behind the scenes, so you can use it for permissions. But it also does some things that a lot of times aren't necessarily the desired outcome. That includes creating a SharePoint site for that group. It's a team site just specifically for that Office 365 group. It creates a team within Microsoft Teams. And those things, what's particularly problematic about that situation is that no one knows that they were created. No one from IT knows they're created. The governance team doesn't know they're created. The site stewards don't know they're created. They just came into existence and no one's managing them. And when we're talking about governance and how important governance is, to all of a sudden have sites and groups just kind of appear, it breaks that governance and it becomes a huge problem for management. That being said, there are very specific use cases where this Office 365 groups can be utilized, and it really centers around agility. And Jared, I think you have an example of that from one of our clients.
So yeah, so before I go there though, I mean, I'm just going to add to some of the things you've said. So I'll give you my honest and my personal opinion of all of this. I'm not a fan of Office 365 groups. I think I'm finally starting to understand. If I look maybe a year or two down the road at where I think Microsoft is actually going, and I don't know that for sure, but where I think they are actually trying to get to, I think I understand why they feel that they need Office 365 groups. But the one problem that I have with many of the things that Microsoft might do as they're traveling down this road to a very awesome place at the end, I think what they do is they introduce something and they don't consider how that's going to affect an organization that needs and requires governance in their environment. And so many of the things that they create all of a sudden are like outside, and we are trying to scramble to figure out, okay, how do we get that governed? How do we get that under control? How do we make sure that it doesn't slide down a hill? And so Microsoft Teams is one of those places, because Teams is a very popular topic. It's very hot. It allows you to be very agile. It's a great piece of work, and I think there's even more that we're going to see come from it as we continue down the road. But when someone generates a new team, like Zach said, it generates a lot of other pieces of the puzzle. And one of those things is how it ties together with SharePoint. So when you store documents and you're storing them through the Teams mechanism, through the Microsoft Teams interface, you're actually storing those in a SharePoint site in the background. That was not created by a SharePoint admin. It was just created by the fact that you created Teams, and Microsoft says, hey, we need to be able to store that document somewhere. Well, we have SharePoint in the background. Why don't we store it there? And it all of a sudden stores it. But not just that, it's as I'm in that one team, if I start creating the channels, thank you, Zach. If I start creating the channels under it, those channels are actually sharing that same Teams site. And so if I have documents in one channel, they're just a folder inside of a library inside of a SharePoint site that was created by Teams. And then if I create a channel for another one, they're just a separate folder inside of there. And so even that is not necessarily a best practice. So I mean, so we have problems with all those things. And so what our clients are struggling with is, how do I take that mechanism that uses Office 365 groups? How do I take Teams and take advantage of it, even though it uses Office 365 groups? And do I completely lock it down so that only admins can create it? And then I, slow poke my way through them being able to get access to it, or being able to share it with other people, or those types of things? Or do I just say, hey, it's a free-for-all and we'll catch up behind the scenes and work it out on our end? We would like to say that our official stance on Teams is that it's not Teams or SharePoint. It is Teams plus SharePoint, but there is a scenario where you can govern it, and we have some practices around that now. We reached out to all of our clients, and we had it's called a roundtable, but we invited everyone in to specifically talk about this one topic and how it was affecting everyone. And we had the full spectrum. We have some clients who it's a free-for-all, create Teams as many times as you want, and we'll catch up on the back end. And we had some who were struggling with, how do I govern it before I pass it out? And we found where we think the middle of the road is, and we now know how we can implement Teams, but also implement SharePoint along with it and actually govern the entire piece. And so my purpose of saying all that is that it can be done, even though this is using Office 365 groups. But the problem with Office 365 groups is when I create one, first of all, it can be created all over the place. So I can be inside of my email and throw up a new group, and all of a sudden there's an Office 365 group. And along with that group came a email address that now the group has access to, a planner, which if you're not familiar with Planner in Office 365, go take a look at it. It's pretty cool for like doing projects. And again, another place that again needs to be governed.
Yeah.
You know, so you need to figure out whether you're going to use, how are you going to do formal projects, how are you going to do informal projects, or whether you're going to, it's a lot. Okay, so Planner. And then also you get a calendar that goes along with that. And then you get, I don't know, a couple other things.
Yeah,
too.
the SharePoint site.
Yeah, the SharePoint site as well. It gets created behind the scenes. So there's a lot of pieces of that puzzle to get created just because you created an Office 365 group.
Yep.
Now, I don't know that in the future they might. I mean, maybe they make a feature in the future that says, oh, create the Office 365 group, but do not create anything else with it. You know, but that's not true today. And the fact that you don't know that these things are being created, you know, so if you're not up to date, if your governance doesn't tell the IT team that they are responsible for being up to date and ahead of all changes, well, when those Office 365 groups dropped into our environments a year or two ago, then all of a sudden they may not have said, oh, well, I'm not going to use these. They might have just either started using them, or they might have been available for end users, and there's just rogue stuff sitting out there. And so it becomes a big problem. So again, this is kind of a large topic that we could probably talk about for hours, but it's very important, and you need to figure out how you're going to control it in your environment.
Yeah, and I was trying to stay unbiased here, but since you went crazy there, I'll go ahead and. I mean, as an IT pro, as someone who administers a network and administers Office 365, I actually very much agree with Jared in that I'm not a huge fan of these, but that the reason I'm not a fan of them is not because the mechanism itself is broken or it doesn't work or something's not right about it, but rather because there isn't a method of governance at this point in time. And like Jared said, you can create these groups all over the place. So if your users were using Microsoft Teams when these Office 365 groups popped up suddenly, and they created a team, they had no idea that all these other pieces were being created behind the scenes. They thought this was just within Teams. So, and like Jared said, as Teams and as Office 365 groups mature, then we're going to see that security and the governance capabilities for them mature as well.
Yeah, and so in the last couple of months, and this is a note from Christine, I believe. Yep. In the last couple of months, there have been changes. And so if you're on first ring of Office 365, you may have seen these changes. There's some environments that we've seen this change in, and some where our clients haven't seen this change yet. So we mentioned that if you go create a Microsoft Teams, that it'll generate a whole bunch of other things for it. There are certain things that are required for it to generate, but it doesn't actually, in the newer versions of it, it doesn't actually have to create all of those things. So they've been working on it, and they know that this is a particular issue because I think the user voice this is one of the ones that's pretty high frustration with, I think. And so yeah, thank you for that information, Christine. We are aware of that. Yep. Okay, so I think we're out of time for that topic. Okay, so let's keep going. There we go.
Okay, so the next topic is following best practices for keeping your data safe and inside your organization.
Yeah, so, sorry. I should wait till the question's asked.
So how secure is my data in Office 365 and SharePoint Online? And does Office 365 and SharePoint Online comply with any compliance standards like HIPAA or PCI?
So yeah, I mean, speaking about passionate subjects here, this is kind of my baby. Security is really one of my big focal points, and you can secure your data within Office 365 and SharePoint Online using a variety of methods, and just by default, there's a lot of security built into the platform for you. And a lot of it does center around some of the regulations and compliance guidelines that are out there, whether it's HIPAA, PCI, ISO 27000, CGIS. SharePoint Online, and by extension Office 365 as a whole, are compliant with these regulations, which is a huge win there. It means that you can put your data there and be confident that it's secured the way that it's supposed to be secured by the way your regulators tell you have to have it secured. And at the same time, they provide you documentation to prove that it is in fact secure and that it's been audited. And they do audits quite regularly, so they do an excellent job with that. And as with most security situations like this, where you're essentially offloading the security responsibility from yourself and your own infrastructure and putting it into Microsoft's hands, so that Microsoft has to be there. They're your partner in that security practice as well.
Yeah. So I mean, I think if you went to the Office, if you have had access, say, as an admin, and went to the Office 365 management console there, you went into the Compliance Center and just took a look at all the different things that they meet. It's actually kind of incredible. I mean, they're very transparent about it as far as all the things that they've been qualified for, certified for. And certification sometimes happens different per state. Like I know that in Iowa, it was a while before they were CGIS compliant, even though like everywhere else in the country, I think they were already compliant there. So some of it has to come from, I don't know what the logistics are behind the scenes, but they're very transparent about it. And they do show you where they are not compliant with something and where they are compliant with something. So that's very, very good. So your data, you can rest assured that your data does meet a specific requirement there. So I will say that I'll just mention this as a side note. Some of our clients, so whether they be like pharmaceutical companies or things like that have really heavy compliance needs, moving to Office 365 for them, one of the advantages that they saw, I don't know whether they actually advertise these things or not, but one of the advantages that they took into consideration, I guess, was that if there's a data breach, they could basically say, hey, well, Microsoft told us this was secure.
Yeah, I mean, they like I said, they offload some of that responsibility, and Microsoft becomes their security partner with securing all of their data.
Yeah.
And the next step to that, sorry, Ryan, I'll just let me get through this real quick.
No, I was just agreeing. You're good.
Okay, cool. So then our seventh best practice that we really like to tell people to use is a component of Office 365 called Azure Information Protection that really allows administrators to define what data it needs to be secured and how it should be secured within the Office 365 environment. And through the Security and Compliance Center can view the compliance of those policies on their data. And this Azure Information Protection actually makes up a couple different technologies, primarily founded in IRM, which is Information Rights Management. And it allows you to take content, data that's, for instance, like a Word document that says contract in it, and apply a label to it, which is just basically a policy, a security policy for it, which may contain retention policy, a permissions policy, and maybe access rights as well for external users. And it will make it so that content is compliant with whatever policies you have in play. And this goes beyond just online documents. This actually gets stored within the document itself. So if you have a Word document that's a contract and you send it to a potential client, and 3 months go by and the document has expired already, and they go to try to open it up, it's not even going to let them open it up. It's going to immediately pop up with a notification saying that the document is expired and no longer valid. Even though it's not in your environment anymore, that data is secure.
I think that's awesome. And I think with Azure Information Protection, the way I kind of look at it is in three pieces. And I'll just give maybe a couple of examples to talk about those. So Zach sends me emails every once in a while about access to a client's environment, and it'll have access information, password, those types of things inside of it. And so when I get that email from him, it's actually encrypted. This is just one of the things that Office 365 can do for you, and the Exchange Online and all that good stuff. And so he sends it, and it's in this encrypted format where I have to basically log in, authenticate, make sure that I am who I am, And if I was to even try to forward that to someone else, then would they be able to open it?
No,
not at all.
Not even in the organization itself.
Yeah. So and I think that's really kind of cool. And that's just, it's there, it's for you, it's out of the box. That's excellent. And then I see a scenario where I'm ashamed to say that I do this a lot. And so I'll give the example of we have a upstairs, one of our developers, his upstairs, you guys know where I'm at. So we have a developer named Dave, and I often want to send him an email, but we also have several clients, and one of the clients that I send a lot of emails to is named Dave also. They have different last names, but when you type in Dave into your email address, it just comes up with the wrong person first. So if I often send, fortunately harmless emails to the wrong Dave every once in a while, and I'm sure everybody's done this. Don't just leave me out here hanging by myself. So if I was to send, say, a contract or something that was internal only to our Dave, but I accidentally typed in the wrong Dave and hit send, and that email goes to the wrong Dave, then it's outside of my organization, and I've pretty much violated our internal policies, and I made a mistake. It was an honest mistake, but I mean, I still made the mistake. What I'd like is a system that can help me not do that anymore. And so through this content labeling, it would be very easy for me to set up a scenario where the library that contract lived in was marked or pre-marked or labeled, I should say, as internal use only. And when I went to send that contract to someone, if I type in a Dave that's external to the company, the email itself should catch it for me and say, hey, I'm not going to send that out because you have someone listed as an external who's an external to our organization, and this document is internal only. And it can do that. And so we think that's very valuable. The process, and the thing about it, it's not hard to set up, and so it's not hard to set up, and it's also not hard to govern. It's not hard to plan whatsoever. I mean, you want to take the simplest route possible for your end users, so I don't want to do like a data classification like I do with, say, content types and figure out what every type of document that I have and then have 800 scenarios that someone could select from. I don't want that. I just want it to be straightforwardly simple. So maybe I have, internal only, okay for external use, okay for partners, and I've got these 3 scenarios. And so I just go through as a power user or someone who's a data owner or a document owner, enters that information into, say, SharePoint. They can go and label it with one of those things, internal only or external, okay for partners. And then when I go to use it as an end user, it's already checking it for me. And I think that's valuable, and I think that's something that's just already built in that you should be able to take advantage of. And then the third scenario Zach already gave, and that is someone tries to maliciously take the data, or they've been gone from the company for quite a while, but then they find this old document that they have, and they try to open that up because it's got contacts on it or something like that, and they say, we want to stop them from actually seeing that document anymore because they are no longer with our organization. And so those are some things that Azure Information Protection can do for you. And I just want to say this, Zach, I'm going to ask Zach this question, he can answer it. If I was to set this up on-prem, by myself and get all the technology that I need to make all this happen, I mean, what kind of cost am I looking at?
Yeah, you're looking at a relatively high cost, at the very least in man hours. Setting up the IRM platform on-prem is very, very time involved, and it does require obviously a server, ideally at quite a couple servers for redundancy and failover and things like that, because obviously if you're gonna encrypt all of your information and then your rights management system is offline, there's nothing to tell the document that you're valid. So right. You have a problem there. So there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle to make it work on-prem, but if you use Azure Information Protection, it's already set up for you. And like Jared said, it's really easy to configure those labels and get that set up the right way. And on top of that, there's some hybrid options where you can actually use Azure Information Protection on premise without all of the additional pieces of technology that you would normally need for an on-premise implementation.
Yeah, and there's like key servers, and this is I guess too technical even for Jared, I guess, but there's like key servers and things like that have to be in place to make all this happen, and those servers are like things that banks use to encrypt their data and stuff, right? And those things, they're not cheap. I mean, I imagine they're pretty expensive. And what Microsoft has done is they've already taken on that cost. And they have all that sitting in the cloud, so it's all ready to go. It works right. Microsoft can't even decrypt your information. So if they were to intercept one of your documents, they can't even look at it. It's just set up the right way. It's all good.
Yeah, and I just want to touch on that real quick here, Jared. That from a security standpoint, yeah, Microsoft can't decrypt your data without your explicit permission to do so. You'll notice it if you have Office 365 and you try to open a support ticket. There's a checkbox that says give Microsoft access to my tenant for 72 hours during this this ticket while it's open, so that they can help with the finding the solution. Otherwise, if you were to open a ticket with Microsoft, they'll actually start a screen share session with you and do everything from your perspective, because they do not have access to your data.
And I would imagine they wouldn't even want access to your data.
No,
I think that's more important. So okay, so I think we're out of time for that topic, and we kind of want to. Do we have any additional questions, Tara?
It didn't look like we had any additional questions. Just what Christine's question, which you answered, but. At this moment, unless anybody has any questions, feel free to type them in right now. But other than that, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. So we want to thank everybody for joining us today, and also want to thank our panelists for providing such great information for us. Just to let you know, I will be sending out all the slides and the link to the recorded webinar later on today. And if just on the screen right now, you can see if you're interested in any of Crow Canyon's products that are some pre-built modules. If you're interested in getting a demo of them, you can contact me. My email address is right there for you, and also Ryan's contact information is there as well. And then for our information, if anything that you need from Spindustry, we'd be happy to help you. If you have more questions about the best practices or governance, anything in that area, feel free to contact me, Jared, or Zach. All our information is right there. And just a reminder, we do have another webinar coming up on January 10th, which is called What is SharePoint? That is one of our most popular webinars. So if you have, if you're interested, I can send out the link to that as well. And we'd love to have you. So thank you, everybody, and thank you to Zach and Jared and Ryan today for being here.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Ryan, for joining us in this discussion. And I really encourage everybody to go out to check out Crow Canyon's website. Good information out there. And thank you, Zach, for being here as well.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.